I would like Madisonians to think about a segment of the Wisconsin populace that both sides of the Walker versus the Unions issue have overlooked, and seem to want to continue to overlook. I'd like to offer a libertarian perspective on this, the one-year anniversary of the Wisconsin Union protests. Are you ready to take back your freedom of peaceful assembly and your freedom of speech? Do you want to put a stop to these wasteful, disastrous, undeclared wars in the Middle East? Do you want to repeal the Patriot Act and the NDAA and stop illegal searches and seizures by the TSA and the FBI? Do you want to end warrantless spying and wiretapping, extrajudicial killing of American citizens, and indefinite detention without trial? Do you want to stop the CIA's funding of an armament of foreign drug lords? Do you want the DEA to stop raiding legal medicinal marijuana dispensaries in Colorado and California? Do you want to pardon all nonviolent drug offenders and legalize the recreational use of marijuana? Do you want to let the states raise their fuel economy standards for automobiles if they think they can do better than the standards set by the EPA? Do you want to give towns and counties in northern Wisconsin the freedom to raise their clean water standards if they think they can do better than the rest of the state and protect themselves against the hazardous health effects caused by the pollutants of mining operations? Do you want the federal government to stop selling out our water, air, and farms to BP, Halliburton, the Chicago Climate Exchange, and Monsanto? Do you want to stop congressional insider trading without making it harder for politicians to disclose to the public the details of the bills that Congress is considering? Do you want to close the revolving door policy regarding politicians, lobbyists, and high-power corporate lawyers? Do you want to end corporate finance of political campaigns and the legal fiction of corporate personhood? Do you want to put an end to these multi-trillion-dollar bailouts that lose taxpayer money, add to the debt, don't stimulate the economy, and make industries harder to regulate instead of easier? Are you prepared to see more of your income taxed away and put your children and grandchildren into debt slavery to pay for this wasteful deficit spending and hundreds of trillions of dollars in unfunded liabilities? Are you tired of the Federal Reserve printing up trillions a year to cover for all this waste, inflating the dollar and devaluing your wages in the process? Are you sick of giving special legal protections to politicians and helping them stay unaccountable to the law and the people they represent? Do you want to abolish secrecy at all levels of government? Several years ago, President Obama promised the American people the most transparent and open administration in history, but it is becoming more apparent every day that this has not happened and is not going to happen. If the events of the last 12 years have taught us anything, is that we can no longer stand for the degree of government secrecy to which we have become accustomed. This is especially obvious in regards to our foreign policy, our intelligence agencies, and our developing lobbying regulation complex. This complex permits legislators and representatives of big business, such as lobbyists and corporate lawyers, to collude to write laws and company policies favorable to their own common interests. It also gives a revolving door for such people to switch jobs, has allowed our politicians to get away with a form of legalized insider trading, erodes at our campaign finance laws, and corrupts the integrity of our election. John F. Kennedy once said, "The very word secrecy is repugnant in an open and free society." So how may we best remove secrecy from our political process? Perhaps we should look even closer to home than lobbying, campaign finance, and congressional insider trading. Perhaps we should look at the very act of voting itself. How long must we suffer the evils posed by voting machines, hacker threats to voting machines, the tabulation of voting machine results in undisclosed locations to counter such threats, and people voting under the names of recently deceased registered voters, which recently corrupted the results of several Republican primaries? How many would agree that Wisconsin's toughened voter identification requirements threaten the integrity of our democracy and undermine the privacy of our secret ballot system? But what if the privacy that the secret ballot system gives to our politicians and to the voting public is the same kind of privacy possessed by the independent private Federal Reserve System? What if the reason that politicians and representatives of business can get away with these backroom handshake deals, and the reason that the president can get away with signing unconstitutional bills with a robotic pen, is precisely because there is no paper trail and no real verifiable signatures? What if the ballot is a contract between the people and their public officials, and the spoken oaths that our politicians take to preserve, protect, and defend the law are meaningless? What if the voluntary written contract is the necessary condition for all open, free, transparent, and legitimate government, and this secret ballot that we never sign is the source of all government secrecy? What if the statute of frauds, which states that no contract to provide goods shall be enforceable unless evidenced in writing, applies to the public goods provided by government, and therefore stands in direct and flagrant violation of the secret ballot voting provision in the state constitution. What if, instead, it is the secret ballot provision, which is in violation of centuries of common contract law upon which the statute of frauds, and, indeed, our entire legal system, is based? How can we expect a politician who has never signed a written oath of office be held legally accountable to a group of people who never signed a written agreement to give him authority? Surely this lack of written evidence that an agreement has been made, coupled with the constitutional provision that no congressman shall be required to respond to questioning except in a speech or a debate, does nothing to prevent the use of government power to ensure that our politicians remain unaccountable for their actions and votes, and irresponsive and irresponsible to the will of the people. What does it mean when our representatives in Congress are immune from prosecution for most misdemeanors, when 5/6 of them cannot be recalled by their constituents, when they have the sole power to impeach other federal public officials, while they themselves are extraordinarily difficult to impeach, and when we do not have the option to vote none of the above and choose not to be represented without a new election being held later? Although we pay their salaries, our public servants do not work for us. Nor can it be said that any mutual exchange occurs in the act of secret ballot voting for political representation. Nor even do we merely work for our politicians, no. Something else entirely is going on here. If the purpose of government is to promote liberty and justice, why then are we required to choose someone to make decisions on our behalfs? Certainly it would be most just for us to have the liberty to make our own decisions, as long as they do not directly harm others or damage their property. Certainly, if we choose to participate in a civil societal system in which actions more debatably immoral than causing direct physical harm are made illegal according to the will of a majority of the people's elected representatives, we owe it to ourselves and to our neighbors, both majority and minority, to establish some mechanism whereby it can be verified that participants in such a system chose to cooperate willingly, voluntarily, and not under duress, and consciously of sound mind and capable of giving informed consent. When did you and I agree to support this government? Who among us can rightfully claim that he was informed and not under duress when he agreed to do so? Do we agree to support this government when we vote? If so, were we informed when our politicians pandered and lied to us? Were we informed when we perfectly and completely understood macroeconomics, constitutional process, and the concerns of our fellow voters? It has been said that the secret ballot system is a safeguard against voter intimidation and bribery. Putting aside that voter intimidation and bribery do exist under the current secret ballot system, who among us can say that he did not vote against one candidate because he was afraid of the kind of controls which that candidate would impose on him? Is this not voter intimidation? Is this not duress? Who among us can say that he did not vote for his candidate of choice because of the economic gains that that candidate promised him? Is this not bribery? If your answer to any of these questions is no, then what about when those threats of control and promises of economic gain would be delivered through methods which violate the Constitution? Some say that when we vote, we agree to support the government, but only for a period of time equal to the length of the term which our elected officials would serve. But do we not agree to support the government for as long as we choose to be citizens? Do native-born Americans indeed choose to become citizens? Do we agree to support this government when we begin to benefit from it by participating in its programs? Who among us can say that he was informed and conscious of what was happening to him when his nurse stamped his footprint onto his souvenir birth certificate, or when his parents signed him up for a social security number in his first weeks of life? Who among us can say that he truly consented to these actions? Being that we were not able to resist them, nor able to understand why we might want to, were these actions not performed under duress and without informed consent? If our civil society is truly based on the consent of the governed, and if participation in it is based on informed consent, then why, when we come of age, does the government not make it known to us that we may choose to opt out of the Social Security system and expatriate ourselves, that is, renounce our federal citizenship? The 14th Amendment provides that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens, but only if they are subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Do we not have the right to choose whether to subject ourselves to the federal government's jurisdiction? The federal government, the governments of the states, and we the people are, after all, equal sovereigns, who only submit to one another willingly. Why is political representation in the U.S. House based on the number of residents in each state who are available to be compelled to fund the operations of government, rather than on the number of people who, willingly and of their own volition, agree to become federal citizens and to support and fund the federal government? Why do the politicians who tell us that citizenship is not an entitlement program now remind us that we have the right to waive and forfeit the benefits of citizenship, thereby relieving the government of the burdensome responsibility to provide for the privileges associated with citizenship? Why do these politicians instead use citizenship not being an entitlement program as an excuse to encourage us to fund and pledge loyalty to the government and to consume its resources? What benefits are we to expect from a system that often requires us to kill and to die against our will for the furthering of its own power? Private property has been defined as the absolute power and freedom to exclusively possess and to use and abuse at one's own discretion. It is the ability to become the sole controller and dominator of an object, and the right to refuse to respond to questions about whether a possession is being either used or abused. But do not our politicians have the power to control and dominate, to use and abuse us at their own discretion? Do not their special privileges from arrest, their power to remove other politicians from office, and our lack of power to refuse to consent to delegate authority to them make their rule over us exclusive and absolute? Does not their legal immunity from questioning, except when we are choosing which one of them will control us, make their rule over us irresponsive and irresponsible? Are our bodies not, then, given over by our parents at birth as possessions to be dominated, absolutely, exclusively, and irresponsibly, by rulers whose authority we have no power, right, or privilege to withdraw consent to delegate? Are we not, then, sold into a system which we are legally incapable of resisting but required to obey? Are we not, then, the literal property of our government masters? Are we not, then, but prisoners and slaves? Are not prisoners permitted to earn and spend money? Are not slaves permitted to breathe fresh air? What is your registration of birth but a contract signed by your parents to permit the government to repossess you if it deems your parents' level of parental care to be below some standard set intentionally high so as to excuse your kidnapping by Child Protective Services, which studies have shown to have much higher rates of physical and sexual abuse than does the general public? So, are you a person or are you a piece of property? Is a corporation a piece of shared property or is it a person? We can actually answer both of these questions at once. What is a person? According to Black's Law Dictionary, statutes may define a person so as to include not only human beings and corporations, but also labor organizations, partnerships, associations, legal representatives, trustees, and others. This would explain why corporations and labor organizations, unions, have the same rights as people when it comes to donating money to political campaigns. Why is the root of the word organization, as in labor organization, organ? Why do we call Congress a legislative body? Why is the root of the word corporation corpus, meaning body? Governments, unions, and businesses do not have real, tangible, physical bodies which can be destroyed like ours can. They have the potential to exist indefinitely. Indeed, President Reagan was not far off when he said, "A government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth." So when do these ghosts, the state, the labor union, and the corporation, steal from us our corporeity, our bodiliness, our attribute of being regarded by the law as possessing a body? In the late 19th century, when a former railroad industry robber baron became a court reporter and injected his own opinion into a U.S. Supreme Court decision about a railroad company, thereby establishing the legal precedent of corporate personhood? Hardly. The U.S. Constitution is not a legal document outlining how we should be governed, as much as it is a contract by the states to cede powers to the federal government in exchange for monetary subsidies, and a promise to share in the payment of the debt which the federal government and military acquired from the British, who funded both sides of the Revolutionary War. This promise was made in secret by the Founding Fathers on behalf of the residents of the colonies, who were never given any opportunity to decide whether to support the new American government. As a side note, let us not forget that it is the loser of the war that pays war debts, and let us ask whether the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 were truly wars between the British and their colonies, or whether they were nothing more than violent civil wars and trade skirmishes which were fought over debt obligations and the legal statuses of citizens, and only brought to a resolution not because of a peace settlement, but because both parties settled financially. Through the Constitution, the states gave the Congress the power to borrow money, and the Constitution provides that no law shall impair the obligation of contracts, financial obligations, and trust not accepted. This agreement by the states to share in the repayment of federal debt was, in truth, a mutual trust, which established the states as financial corporate subsidiaries of the corporate federal government. The United States is, effectively, a plantation, a tax farm. I'd like to pause for a moment to caution my audience. Let it never be said that no self-described libertarian has ever criticized the Constitution or its framers. Indeed, so long as one takes a close, honest look at the wording of that document, and probes the true legal meaning of each important word, there is a thin and blurry line between a libertarian who strongly supports the Constitution and a libertarian who strongly opposes the Constitution. But I digress. The reason the 14th Amendment uses the word citizen and the word person, rather than using either word twice, is because these words have different meanings. In truth, the 14th Amendment created two separate and legally distinct classes of people. A person is a natural, flesh-and-blood human being who has a real body, capital C citizenship, and individual sovereign power within the independent common law state in which he resides. A small c citizen is a naturalized artificial corporate person who has a piece of paper with his all-capitalized name on it in a file drawer in the office of a government bureau, privileges and immunities, although no rights or protections, and an obligation to pay the debts contracted by the federal government on his behalf. Every state in this union is a sovereign and independent country in and of itself, and legal documents spanning from 1783 to just 3 years ago will confirm that. The Constitution only authorizes the federal government to have jurisdiction over the District of Columbia and over the lands it has purchased, that the U.S. Supreme Court has confirmed that the federal government has jurisdiction over lands it has conquered. Therefore, if the federal government has jurisdiction over a state, it is either because it has purchased or conquered that state, or because that state has allowed itself to be purchased or conquered. Likewise, if the federal government has jurisdiction over you, it is either because it has purchased or conquered you, or because you have allowed yourself to be purchased or conquered by it. Unless and until you and I in the states resist and reassert our sovereign powers, rights, and protections, our corporate federal government literally owns the states within this union, along with all the businesses, tangible and intellectual property, and human beings which exist within them. This is what I meant when I brought up the birth certificate, the registration of birth. Because we are required to register our cars, the government can repossess them if it doesn't like the way we are using them. Just as our parents registered us, the government can repossess us if it doesn't like the way our parents are using their freedom to raise us as they see fit. Just as we are required to take out insurance policies on our cars, we are now required to take out health insurance policies. But we can choose whether to buy a car. We cannot choose whether to own our bodies. Our cars, like our bodies, are the property of the government, and therefore can be regulated like property. There is virtually no private property, and no private sector, left in this country. All is subject to governmental regulation. Anything you think you own, your body, your car, your house, your business, you merely rent, use, possess, or occupy temporarily. All goods and services are deemed to be subject to the whims of the public sector government, and able to be repossessed by it via eminent domain, and sold off, privatized, to some other temporary user. But privatization is a province of government. This is the closest thing to real private property which still exists. You may think you own your business, but through charter it becomes the property of the state, which will take from you in property taxes, personal income taxes, and corporate income taxes, however much it pleases. You may think you own your car, but you are required to have a license, registration, and insurance if you don't want the government to repossess it. You may think you own your own body, but take a look at your birth certificate. Your name is capitalized. This capitalization makes you an artificial person, a naturalized corporate citizen, with no legal rights or protections, but only the privileges and immunities conferred upon you by the federal government. You are not a name on a piece of paper in a file drawer in a government bureau in the nation's capital. You are a soul who possesses a body, an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and sovereign power equal to the federal government to affect state policy. Although you never signed your birth certificate, consenting to be identified as your all-capitalized name, you did sign your driver's license, and you checked in the box on your census form identifying yourself as a U.S. citizen. Although the federal government has not made it widely known that we do not have to submit to it, we still retain our natural right of expatriation, the right to renounce our federal citizenship without having to submit to the jurisdiction of some foreign government. The budget of the federal government is 80 times larger than the budget of the government within the average given state. Congress is now committed to spend some $160 trillion in unfunded liabilities within our lifetimes, nearly 10 times greater than the amount of wealth produced in the country in a single year, and 10% greater than the amount of wealth produced on the planet in a year. These figures are set to double every 3.5 years. Despite these facts, and despite the fact that we become second-class citizens when we cede our authority to the federal government, whereby, in the process, we agree to help the government pay for such extravagant, irresponsible spending, there exist huge portions of supporters of both major political parties which emphasize a greater role for the federal government in our everyday lives. Why should we accept this? Why should we accept the federal government's supremacy in creating policy, overriding the decisions made in the states and in the county and municipal governments? Why shouldn't we argue for a greater role for the states and the local governments in creating policy, and for providing public goods and public services? Why should we agree to maintain the federal government's monopoly power? Why should the more local governments not compete against the federal government to put forth better policies and to provide better public services, thereby undermining the federal monopoly power to do these things? Why should we count on the federal government, rather than the more local governments, to defend us from the power of the states? Are we to continue to pretend that the federal government knows better than the states what their residents want, and that the states know better than the communities what their residents want? This is the principle of subsidiarity, the principle that decision-making authority should be as close to the people it affects as would be effective, efficient, and responsible. It is the principle of subsidiarity which is the reason for the 10th Amendment, the States' Rights Amendment, and for the institution of dual federalism, the idea that states have supreme power in certain policy areas, while the federal government has power only in the areas in which the states allow it. But opponents of these principles are too apt to characterize states' rights as permitting slavery, ignoring the probability that it would allow California and Colorado to legalize medicinal marijuana, allow a third of the states to raise their standards on the fuel efficiency of vehicles, allow the states actually affected by the Keystone Pipeline to decide whether to permit its construction, rather than the federal government treating land in the Great Plains states as its own property, and that intrastate subsidiarity would allow towns in northern Wisconsin to raise their standards on water safety and to protect themselves against decisions made in Madison to damage the health of the local and native populations with mining operations. For the states to stand up against the federal government by reasserting their rights to enact policy would compromise the federal government's monopoly power to provide public goods and public services. State governments' policies would, in essence, compete against the policies of the federal government, thus undermining its power. But to bring about a more perfect competition against government in general would require that additional steps be taken. I don't see this public sector unions controversy as a question of whether Governor Walker or the Democrats have the interests of public employees at heart. I interpret it as an example of unwillingness by both sides of the aisle to take steps towards diminishing the power of government and its bureaucracies to force us, the taxpayers, to pay for them to provide us with those goods and services which are typically thought of as public. While opponents of Governor Walker are apt and correct to criticize the government when it increases the power of corporations, leading to corporate personhood, business monopolies and oligopolies, privatization schemes, and government sponsorship of enterprises, they are not willing to admit that corporate greed, which is nothing more than business executives trying to return wealth to their investors through profit, is not the problem. The problem is that we have a government which is powerful enough to give those privileges to businesses at the expense of the taxpayers. The desire of private persons to obtain and increase their wealth has existed since the dawn of time, and will never cease to exist, no matter how hard we may try to regulate that desire away. But when we give our government the power to give special rights to certain businesses, and to award contracts to provide public goods and services to certain businesses, we are giving a signal to the market that the government will compel people to use their services and buy their goods. This is why force and compulsion are antithetical to the freedom of the marketplace, and why competition is antithetical to monopoly and oligopoly. It is forceful government violence corrupting peaceful market freedom, the ancient struggle of brute force playing itself out in the market. Contrary to what those who support central economic planning may tell you, competition does not inevitably lead to a monopoly in a free market. Competition only leads to monopoly when the government decides to establish special privileges for, and award contracts and charters to, the least ethical, most ruthless competitors. Provide an avenue for smaller governments to engage in a more robust competition against centralized government power, and you will see a domination of industries by a select few businesses become greatly diminished. But aside from the monopoly powers of government and the monopoly powers of business, opponents of Governor Walker also tend to overlook the monopoly powers of unions, and even the corporate personhood which Citizens United granted to labor organizations in addition to corporations. Why should the status of corporate person not be denied to both in the interest of fairness? Why should the labor movement, a large segment of which evidently fashions itself anarchistic, support government guarantees of certain unions' power to exclusively represent workers in negotiations with management? Gone are the days of dual and multiple unionism and wildcat strikes, which were once the tactically pure principles of the labor movement, uncorrupted by the desire of institutionalization and privilege conferred by coercive monopoly government. This conflict was the reason for the 1924 split in the industrial workers of the world, between those who sought political privilege for unions, and those who sought to refrain from using violent government power to compel others to accede to their demands, but instead to make employers and the public aware of and sympathetic to their concerns, and to spread information about the plight of the working man through peaceful discourse and convincing rhetoric. But the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt effectively ended this dispute among the labor movement at large. In 1935, his National Labor Relations Act outlawed wildcat strikes, and required management to negotiate with only those agents authorized to represent their employees. Certainly we can agree that when workers with more modest demands form their own rival union to compete with the established union in their workplace, this can undermine worker solidarity within that workplace. But when a more radical, idealistic, and extreme segment of employees feel that the established union is being too modest and call for a wildcat strike, the established union can bring charges against the more extreme workers, sacrificing their just demands in the name of getting things done. Thus, we see the established unions undercutting the efforts of both the more modest and the more extreme workers, each group of which assuming the risk and responsibilities associated with their own actions. It becomes evident that, primarily, the established unions seek not solidarity, but rather the entrenchment of their exclusive power to negotiate on the behalf of workers, their own monopoly power of representation. To this day, the industrial workers of the world promotes dual unionism, and even goes so far as to recommend that non-unionized workers engage in solidarity unionism tactics, rather than to pursue the legalistic strategies that have led us to the current mess. Indeed, perhaps the IWW's humble anarchism explain why it claims just 1/900th as many members as the AFL-CIO, 1/10 of whose members are in the business of providing public services, and another 10th of whose members are in the automobile industries, companies and unions in which were bailed out under Bush and Obama. Despite all his rolling back of union privileges, Governor Walker has stated that he has no desire to use the provisions of the Taft-Hartley Act to make Wisconsin a right-to-work state, and to the detriment of the labor movement. For history has shown that when and where union membership is optional and voluntary, union membership tends to increase, at least in the short term. Being that the public sector workers who struck a year ago were government employees, the fact that they strengthened their appeals to and rapport with the party more inclined to support them was to be expected, but it was not well advised. I submit that if the Republicans' assault on their supposed rights was so egregious, then they should have used the opportunity which this crisis presented to show their independence rather than their dependence, thus proving that they are as powerful, if not more so, than the government. They should have gone into competition with the government. They should have shown that they provide public services so efficiently, effectively, and responsibly that any rational person would choose to use their services rather than those which would still be provided by the government. Why didn't public employees show their strength by competing against the government, thus proving their worth? Maybe they know something we don't know. The more important question is, why in this time of reckless government spending and unprecedented state intrusion into our daily lives are individuals who supposedly value their privacy and their individual rights begging the government to stay the same size and entrench the privileges of its employees? And how does the situation in Wisconsin relate to the situation of the country as a whole? The actions of the Obama administration have shown its reluctance to cut taxes, spending, government services, and the size of the federal payroll, and it appears unwilling to allow private enterprise and the governments of the states to compete against it to provide public services. The current administration has even gone so far as to reduce tax breaks for charitable contributions, which I interpret as an assertion that the government is more moral than are the people, and that it has the right to take from anyone who would attempt to bypass its inflation taxes and the overhead fees of its corrupt bureaucracies in using their freedom to help others. I believe that the state and local governments, the private sector, especially small and local business entrepreneurs, and fledgling labor unions pose some of the most significant threats to the perception that the federal government, government-sponsored enterprises, and unions with government privilege are the most legitimate, moral, efficient, and qualified to provide public goods and services, and, as such, experimentation regarding their role competing against the federal government to do so should be encouraged. Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at a point in American political economy when the majority of leftists have deviated from their social anarchist roots and acceded to the power of the established centralized federal social democracy, even, sadly, the would-be mutualist anarchists, who have exalted both the free market principle of competitive capital and the anarcho-syndicalist principle of competitive labor. But the extent to which an embrace of mutualism would solve the problem of competitive labor and capital, the problem of competing against monopoly government, specifically centralized monopoly government, remains to be addressed in our public discourse. In particular, the monopoly power that Governor Walker and the Republicans currently have the potential to wield over regulating the benefits and negotiation privileges of government employees providing public services. Make no mistake, the Democrats constitute no real challenge to the current Republican power monopoly. In fact, most, if not all, Democrats actually desire to entrench the government monopoly, specifically through increased taxation, which would provide for the expansion of government cooperation with both established unions and established capital. We would be hard-pressed to find a single Democrat in power who consistently votes to encourage competition in both established monopoly labor and business privilege. So replace Governor Walker with a Democrat if you must. Replace him with a big government, pro-gun control Democrat who wants to chip away, even further than the Republicans do, at your right to defend yourself against those who would seek to threaten violence against you for rightfully asserting that you never knowingly entered into a contract promising to give them as much money and blood as they please for the rest of your life. Or, instead, we can bring charges against our state governments, compelling them to decide whether the statute of frauds violates the secret ballot provisions in the state constitutions, or whether the secret ballot, by its very design, flies in the face of basic principles of the Anglo-American Common Contract Law, essentially getting the states to declare whether their authority comes from us voluntarily giving up our right to make some of our decisions, or else that their powers are only based on domination, control, and violence. Instead, we can abandon these specters of secret, coercive, monopolistic government, capital, and labor, and provide public goods and services through gift-giving, bartering, trading, and sharing, through philanthropy by private citizens to charity and religious organizations, through the efforts of small and local private businesses seeking to undermine the strength of the established multinational corporations and state-sponsored enterprises, through consumer and citizen advocacy agencies, through open and legitimate municipal, county, and state government, and through direct action, general and work-to-rule strikes, picketing, boycotts, and confrontation of management by freely associating and disassociating segments of mutually sympathetic workers, lest we consign ourselves to manipulation by big labor leaders, corporate lobbyists and attorneys, and corrupt, well-paid career politicians in the national government, who until this very moment have used us as pawns to entrench their own wealth and power. Instead, we can revive the principle enshrined in the 10th Amendment, that the powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people, ushering in a new era wherein the federal government's grip on our everyday affairs is greatly loosened, permitting us to engage in policy experimentation in which participatory democracy and local governance are exalted over representative democracy and centralized governance. For only then may we learn to tolerate a diversity of opinion and of administration of best practices, and come to discern for our own subjective purposes, of ourselves and our communities, which combination of practices suits us best. Let us take the crisis which Governor Walker has created by cutting government funding to public service as an opportunity to let volunteers fill the void, to educate our youth, to care for our sick, to build our roads, to provide us clean water, to put out fires, to keep our streets safe, and to protect and defend our businesses, our property, and ourselves. Let us require no teacher, health worker, police officer, or fireman to worry about his pay and benefits while toiling under the reign of a politician who doesn't represent his political and economic interests. Let those who provide public goods and services, Republican or Democrat, Libertarian or Socialist, work to provide them in the way they see fit. Let us do away with the notion that the best way to care for the less fortunate and underprivileged, and to provide for the average person's everyday needs, is to force us to pay taxes, funnel them through corrupt, wasteful, bureaucratic middlemen, devalue that money through inflation brought about by our usurious national centralized Federal Reserve Bank, and require us, at the threat of fines and imprisonment, to purchase the products and services of unethical companies who have successfully curried the favor of our politicians. Let us use our right of expatriation to cease associating ourselves with the world's largest and wealthiest criminal gang which calls itself the United States federal government. Let us use our inalienable rights and our common law sovereign powers within our states to effect an even greater protection of the freedoms of speech, press, and peaceful assembly, and the rights of the accused and of self-defense, than our federal government now seems willing to provide us. Let us begin to view the debts it has contracted under our names and the taxes it has extracted from us as evidence that they have committed crimes against us. Let us assume the responsibility to bring charges and punishment against those who would provide aid, comfort, or material support to our treasonous alien enemy, the state. Let us pay to one another the criminal restitutions which the government owes to all of us, without worry that these government thugs will resurface and force us to give them a cut of every transaction which we may take part in our quest to provide each other with the means to subsist. Let us abolish this conception of the state as having a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, which President Obama has endorsed, proclaim that no violence is legitimate, and bring about truly free association with voluntary unionization, voluntary interaction with businesses, and voluntary government. Achieve these goals, and you will have total liberty and equality of opportunity, without sacrificing a financially secure outcome for those who would provide us safety, peace, and prosperity. Thank you.